The debris field stretched for 11 light minutes. Sensor analyst Vethara had been cataloging stellar phenomena for 31 years, and she had never once needed to stop breathing to process what her instruments were telling her. She stopped breathing now. Not because of the scale. The Dominion's instruments had mapped nebulae that dwarfed this scatter of wreckage by orders of magnitude. She stopped because of one small detail that her console kept flagging, and that she kept dismissing, and that kept returning. Every hull fragment in the field was oriented the same direction. Not randomly tumbling, not scattered by explosion or gravitational drift. Every single piece, tens of billions of tons of hegemony battle steel across 11 light minutes of open space, was pointed asterisk inward asterisk, toward the human system, as if the ships hadn't been destroyed outward from some central detonation, as if they had been turned around. As if, at the very end, every one of those million ships had been trying to leave. She filed the report. She included the orientation data. She flagged it as requiring senior review. Then she sat in the silence of her observation bay and stared at a piece of wreckage rotating slowly against the starfield, and she thought about the fact that the hegemony fleet had entered human space 14 months ago, and thought about the fact that no signal had come out. Not a distress beacon, not a battle report, not a single automated emergency pulse from any of the 1 million warships that had crossed that border. 14 months of silence, and then this. The hegemony had announced the campaign with the particular confidence of a civilization that had never lost a war it chose to start. Vethara remembered the transmission. Everyone remembered it. Supreme Executor Kaeldros standing at the rostrum of the Grand Convocation, his secondary arms folded in the gesture that meant absolute certainty, his voice carrying the flat, clean cadence of mathematical proof. The human species, he had said, occupies 11 systems. They field approximately 9,000 warships. Their most advanced propulsion technology lags behind hegemony standard by a factor of 6. Their biological limitations, specifically their need for sleep, their emotional volatility, their demonstrated inability to process battlefield data at optimal speed, make them functionally unsuitable for extended military engagement. The campaign will conclude within 90 standard days. The Galactic Dominion, officially neutral, had quietly agreed. Their own military analysts had run the numbers. 12 separate projections, 12 separate methodologies. Average projected campaign duration, 83 days. Margin of error, plus or minus 11 days. Not one model had included a variable for campaign failure. Not one model had accounted for whatever had happened in that debris field. Vethara pulled up the mass spectrometry breakdown of the nearest hull fragments. Hegemony battle steel confirmed. Hegemony alloy signatures confirmed. And then, embedded in the scan data, something that made her secondary heart skip a full cycle. Human alloy traces, woven into the hegemony steel, not as contamination, not as debris impact, molecularly integrated as if the two metals had been fused under conditions of extraordinary heat and pressure, and then cooled together, and then shattered together. The human ships hadn't just survived the engagement. At some point, they had been close enough to touch. The Dominion dispatched an investigation fleet 6 days after Vethara's report reached high command. Fleet scholar Orun Vasht commanded it, a political appointment, technically, which was how Vethara found herself aboard as the only analyst who had actually read the sensor data rather than a summary of it. Orun Vasht was not a stupid creature. He was simply a creature who had spent 40 years being told that his models of the galaxy were correct, which is a harder thing to recover from than stupidity. "Walk me through the orientation finding again," he said, standing at the holographic display table in the command center, his 4 eyes cycling through different focus configurations as he studied the debris map. Every fragment, same direction. "Within a 3-degree variance," Vethara said, "which is consistent with gravitational drift over 14 months, not with random destruction scatter. You're suggesting they turn to flee. I'm suggesting the data suggests they turn to flee. I'm not suggesting anything about what caused them to turn. Orcs was quiet for a moment. Around the table, 6 other senior analysts and 3 military advisors waited with the careful stillness of subordinates who have opinions they have decided not to voice yet. 1 million warships, he said finally, turned to flee. Yes, and were destroyed anyway. Vithara didn't answer, because the answer was obvious, and because saying it aloud felt like it would make something true that she wasn't ready to accept yet. Orcs pulled up the campaign history file. 14 months of external observation data, long-range scans, gravitational readings, electromagnetic monitoring from Dominion observation posts outside human space. We have partial records, he said. The posts weren't inside the engagement zone, but they logged what they could. I want to go through them chronologically. I want to understand what we missed. What they had missed, it turned out, was almost everything. But the partial records were enough to start understanding that the models had been wrong in ways that went much deeper than variables and margins of error. The first anomaly appeared at Day 12. Day 12 of the hegemony campaign. The invasion fleet had crossed the border at 17 designated entry points simultaneously, deploying in the standard hegemony pincer formation that had ended 6 prior wars without modification. The human response, according to long-range electromagnetic monitoring, was initially consistent with what the models predicted: scattered defensive fire, retreat patterns, repositioning. The human fleet concentrated, which was expected. Concentrating meant they could be encircled. Except they didn't concentrate at a defensive position. They concentrated at a point that the hegemony formation was moving asterisk toward anyway. They ran toward the fleet, one of the military advisors said, not a question, disbelief restructured as statement. Long-range reading, Vithara said, pulling up the visualization. Human fleet convergence point here. Hegemony forward elements here. The humans placed themselves exactly where the hegemony advance would arrive within 48 hours. Every human warship in the path of the largest military force ever assembled in this region of the galaxy. Suicidal positioning, the advisor said. That was the hegemony's assessment too, Vithara said. Their battle logs, the fragments we recovered from the wreckage, indicate they interpreted the human positioning as either a catastrophic tactical error or a mass surrender approach. She paused. Around the table, everyone was very still. It was neither, she said. The recovered battle logs, partial, corrupted, reconstructed from crystalline memory fragments pulled from the debris, showed what happened next in disconnected pieces, like a broken mirror that still reflected something recognizable if you tilted it right. The human fleet had not stopped at the convergence point. They had passed through it and kept going, directly into the leading edge of the hegemony formation. Not a charge, not a suicidal rush, something more deliberate, something with geometry. They were trying to get inside the formation's minimum engagement range, Orcs said slowly. He had been quiet for several minutes, studying the visualization from different angles. Hegemony, long-range weapons require a minimum arming distance. Inside that distance there. Useless, the military advisor finished. His voice had changed quality. The hegemony designed their fleet for long-range engagement superiority. They never optimized for close quarters. No one does. There's no tactical doctrine for close quarters engagement at this scale because no rational military would choose it. The casualty exchange rate is catastrophically unfavorable. For both sides, Vithara said, the humans knew that. The room was silent. They chose catastrophic mutual casualties, Orcs said, to neutralize the hegemony's primary advantage. On day 12, Vithara said, of a campaign the models projected would end on day 83. The first misinterpretation became clear 3 days into their review of the recovered data. At day 12, the hegemony commanders had concluded that the human close quarters charge was desperation, irrational, emotional. The biological deficiencies the Supreme Executor had cited, the volatility, the inability to process battlefield data calmly, were being expressed, they believed, as suicidal aggression. They had filed battle reports describing the human tactic as *instinct-driven rather than doctrine-driven. They had, in doing so, completely misunderstood what they were watching. They thought the humans were panicking, Oranvasht said. Yes. And they adjusted their formation accordingly, to encircle and contain a panicking force. Yes, which put the encircling elements, Vithara highlighted the formation map, exactly here. Inside the minimum arming distance, the military advisor said. He rubbed his primary hand across the smooth surface of the table, a gesture that seemed involuntary, a need to feel something solid and predictable. The hegemony commanders moved their own ships into the kill zone because they thought they were responding to an emotional breakdown. And the human commanders had predicted they would, Vithara said. The geometry of the convergence point. The humans placed themselves at the exact location that would cause a tactically rational response from the hegemony to create an encircling formation with maximum vulnerability. They didn't charge because they were panicking. They charged because they knew the hegemony would assume panic and respond to panic in a specific, predictable way. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Vithara became aware of the ventilation system's low hum, a sound she had stopped noticing weeks ago. They modeled us, Oranvasht said finally, not the hegemony, us, all rational military civilizations, the assumption of emotional inferiority, the conclusion that a charge was panic, the reflex to encircle a breaking enemy. They modeled how we would interpret their own irrationality, and then they used our interpretation as a weapon. That's day 12, Vithara said quietly. There are 14 months of records. She had not slept properly since boarding the investigation fleet, not because the workload prevented it, though it did, but because every time she reached a state approaching rest, her mind returned to the fragment orientation data. 1,000,000 ships all turned inward, all turned toward the thing they had been trying to escape. She kept asking herself what would make 1,000,000 ships turn around, what they had seen, what they had understood at the end. She filed that question in the part of her mind reserved for things she intended to return to when she had more information. It kept escaping. At day 31 of the campaign, the electromagnetic records showed something that had no explanation in any military doctrine Vithara had studied. The hegemony had successfully destroyed an estimated 40% of the human fleet, catastrophic losses by any standard, losses that by every model should have constituted effective military collapse, and the human fleet had responded by *splitting*. Not retreating, not regrouping, splitting into fragments and dispersing across 7 different vectors, deep into human-occupied space, drawing the hegemony formation after them in pursuit. They scattered, the military advisor said, studying the track visualization. After 40% losses, they scattered. That's the obvious interpretation, Vithara said. He looked at her. You have a different one. The hegemony had, at that point, spent 19 days in human space. They had consumed approximately 32% of their resupply capacity. Their forward supply lines stretched back through 3 transit points. She pulled up the logistical overlay. The human fleet didn't scatter. It separated into 7 distinct strike forces, each one moving toward a different hegemony supply transit point. The military advisor stared at the overlay for a long moment. They needed the hegemony to pursue them, he said. They needed the hegemony fleet to move away from its own supply lines, and they needed the hegemony to believe they were pursuing a broken, fleeing enemy rather than being drawn into a logistical ambush. For 19 days, Oranvasht said, They absorbed 40% fleet losses to set up a supply line interdiction. They calculated exactly how much they could lose, the military advisor said. His voice had taken on a quality Vithara didn't immediately recognize, and then she did. It was the quality of a professional encountering something that violated the foundational principles of his profession. And they chose to lose it, on purpose. They chose to watch 40% of their ships die because the operational payoff required it. How do you model that? Oranvasht asked. No one answered because the answer was, you don't. You can't build a predictive model for an opponent who is willing to treat their own casualties as a controlled variable. Every military model ever constructed assumed the enemy was attempting to minimize their own losses. Remove that assumption and every projection collapses. This was, Vithara realized, the moment the hegemony should have retreated. Day 31. 40% losses absorbed. Pursuit into unknown territory at the enemy's chosen pace. The model was already broken. The rational decision was withdrawal, resupply, strategic reassessment. The hegemony had not withdrawn. They had, the records showed, increased pursuit speed. Because their models still said the humans were breaking. Because their models couldn't account for what was actually happening. Because the humans knew their models couldn't account for it, and had designed everything around that blind spot. Day 67 was where Oranvasht stopped the review session and asked everyone except Vithara to leave. She waited while the room emptied. He stood at the display table with the Day 67 data projected in front of him, a three-dimensional electromagnetic record of an engagement near the fourth human planet, a world called, in the human language that the Dominion's translation systems rendered imperfectly, something like Mars asterisk. Tell me what I'm looking at, he said. He meant, tell me what you think is actually happening, not what the data literally shows. At Day 67, Vithara said, the hegemony had successfully penetrated to the inner human system. 4 of 11 human-occupied systems had been taken. The human fleet was at approximately 30% original strength. She paused. The hegemony commanders believed they were weeks from total victory. Their battle reports used the phrase mopping up operations. And the humans had been evacuating their civilian population from the 4 occupied systems for 63 days. Oranvasht looked at her. They knew which systems they were going to lose, she said. Before the campaign began, or very shortly after it started, they identified the 4 systems the hegemony would take and they began moving civilians. The hegemony occupied 4 human systems and found, the battle logs confirm this, almost no civilian population. Industrial infrastructure, yes. Habitation structures, yes. But the people were gone. Where? This was the question that had kept her awake. The records don't show inbound civilian traffic to the remaining 7 systems at the volume you'd expect. The humans moved approximately 4 billion civilians out of the path of the hegemony advance. She looked at him steadily. And they didn't move them to safer human worlds. Oranvasht's 4 eyes shifted focus in sequence, a biological tell that meant he was restructuring an assumption. They moved them somewhere the hegemony wouldn't look. Somewhere outside human space, Vithara said. Somewhere the hegemony's search patterns wouldn't cover. I think they dispersed 4 billion civilians into deep space, into prepared positions, months before the campaign began. Which means they anticipated the invasion, Oranvasht said. They did more than anticipate it. I think they planned around it. I think the entire campaign, from the human perspective, was a campaign they had already decided to fight on their own terms in their own chosen sequence at a time, and in a manner that the hegemony believed the hegemony had chosen. She stopped. She hadn't said this part aloud before, had only moved around its edges in her own thoughts. The hegemony didn't invade humanity. Humanity let the hegemony in. The room was very quiet. Fleet Scholar, she said, I need to show you what the Day 67 records actually contain, not the engagement data. The other reading. She expanded the electromagnetic record. Among the clean data of weapons fire and fleet movement, buried in what would ordinarily be background noise, the monitoring post had logged a pattern of low-frequency transmissions. At the time, the automated system had flagged them as interference and filtered them out. Vithara had found them when she stopped looking at the filtered data and started looking at what had been removed. Those transmissions, Oranvash said, what are they? They're coordinated, she said, timed, repeating on a 12-hour cycle, and they're not coming from the human fleet. She highlighted the origin points. They're coming from inside the four systems the hegemony occupied, from within hegemony-controlled territory. Oranvash stared at the highlighted points for a long time. Stay behind assets. The humans didn't evacuate completely, Vithara said. They left people inside the occupied systems. Not soldiers, the transmission signatures aren't military. I've had the translation team look at the fragments we can decode. They appear to be observation reports. Population movement, fleet positioning, supply depot locations. She let that settle. For 63 days, the hegemony had been occupying human systems, while human observers inside those systems transmitted everything they saw back to the human command structure. The hegemony was being watched, Oranvash said, from inside its own conquered territory. By civilians, Vithara said. Volunteers, I think. People who chose to stay behind in occupied territory, transmitting intelligence, knowing what would happen if they were found. She watched something move across Oranvash's face that she didn't have a word for in her language. She thought it might be the expression of a creature encountering a concept of courage so far outside its framework that it read, initially, as something else. As madness, perhaps, as incomprehensibility. The hegemony never knew, he said. The hegemony never knew, she confirmed. For 63 days, they occupied human space and believed they were winning, while humans they had never detected fed their positions, their movements, their supply status, and their command decisions to the human military. Every tactical response the human fleet made in that period, the apparently random repositioning, the strikes that seemed poorly timed and then turned out to be devastatingly well-timed, all of it was built on intelligence the hegemony didn't know it was providing. She pulled up the engagement record from day 72. 5 days after the transmissions she'd identified. The human fleet, at 30% strength, had struck the hegemony supply depot network in a coordinated assault across 6 points simultaneously. The timing had been exact to within minutes. The hegemony had lost 70% of its remaining resupply infrastructure in 4 hours. The battle logs showed the hegemony commanders had been stunned. The strike was described as asterisk, impossibly well coordinated for a force of this size and condition asterisk. One commander's log entry read, "How do they know where everything is?" He was right to ask that question, Oranvash said. He never got an answer, Vithara said. The logs end 3 months later. Most of the commander's logs end around the same time. The fleet kept fighting, kept filing reports, but the reports get shorter, more fragmented. The last entries across dozens of recovered logs share a pattern. She hesitated. They stop describing tactical situations. They start describing the translation is imprecise, something like a feeling, a growing awareness of something they can't identify. What does that mean? I don't know yet, she said. I think we need to get to the end of the timeline to understand the beginning. Day 103. The hegemony had lost 60% of its original fleet strength, but so had the humans, perhaps more. The monitoring records couldn't distinguish the two sides' casualty counts accurately at this stage, because by day 103, the two fleets were so deeply intermixed, so close, operating in such a tight geometry of constant engagement, that the electromagnetic signatures had merged into something the monitoring post's automated systems had no category for. The analysts reviewing that data had filed it as sensor malfunction. Vithara had pulled the raw feeds. It wasn't malfunction. It was a battle that looked like nothing in any historical record because it didn't follow any battle doctrine, any known battle doctrine. Because one side had abandoned doctrine entirely, and the other was trying to apply doctrine to an opponent that had stopped using one. By day 100, she told the table, which she had asked everyone to return to, the human military appears to have stopped having a fleet strategy. Collapsed command structure, the military advisor asked. I thought so, then I looked closer. She pulled up the movement analysis. Individual human ships are making tactical decisions at the unit level that are coherent, not random, not broken. Each individual ship is acting in a way that is locally intelligent, but there's no visible central coordination. The hegemony command structure, by contrast, is still issuing fleet-wide orders, still trying to implement formation doctrine, still functioning as a centrally directed force. The humans decentralized their command. Completely. Each ship captain, apparently, had the authority and the information to act independently. The hegemony fleet was trying to fight a formation battle against an opponent that had dissolved its formation and turned into something more like, she searched for the analogy, more like an immune system than an army. No central point that could be targeted. No command structure that could be disrupted. Every unit capable of functioning, deciding, and striking on its own. And this happened when? Oranvasht asked. I can't pin an exact date. Gradually, over weeks. I think the human command made the decision somewhere around day 80. I think they recognized that their command infrastructure was becoming a liability, that every centralized decision added latency, that the hegemony was beginning to predict their coordination patterns. So they stopped coordinating in the way the hegemony expected coordination to work. They gave up control, the military advisor said, and the way he said it conveyed the profound wrongness of that decision from every military framework he'd ever learned. You do not give up control. Control is the point. Command and control is not a method of war. It is the definition of war as opposed to chaos. They distributed it, Vithara said, which looked from outside like they were losing cohesion. The hegemony's Day 85 battle reports described the human fleet as showing signs of command breakdown. They increased offensive pressure, expecting a collapse. She paused. What they got instead was 1,100 individual human ships making 1,100 independent, locally intelligent, mutually supporting decisions simultaneously, with zero communication lag, because they weren't communicating with each other. They were each reading the same battle and each concluding the same things, because they'd been trained for exactly this. The room was silent again. They trained for this, Oranvasht said. They anticipated that they would need to fight without a command structure. I think they anticipated, Vithara said carefully, that the hegemony would try to destroy their command structure, so they made destroying it irrelevant. She let that sit. Then she moved the timeline forward. Day 149. 3 weeks before the debris field she had first surveyed. The records from this period were the most fragmented, the most difficult to reconstruct, because whatever was happening in human space by this point was generating interference that the monitoring posts hadn't been designed to handle. But 3 records survived clearly enough to be meaningful. The first was an automated distress signal from a hegemony supply vessel, one of the last still operational. The signal itself was standard, but embedded in the signal's metadata, in a field that should have contained only technical calibration data, was a message, in hegemony script, written by a hegemony crew member, short enough that Vithara had read it 30 times and still wasn't sure she understood it. They are everywhere we have not looked. When we turn to face them, they are somewhere else. When we run, they are ahead of us. I do not think we are fighting a fleet anymore. I do not know what we are fighting. The second record was a fragment of a command channel transmission, damaged enough that only a few seconds were recoverable. A hegemony fleet commander's voice, the tone unrecognizable as any emotional register Vethara had encountered in 40 years of xenolinguistic study. The translation team had done their best. Tell the Supreme Executor. And then static. Not what we thought. Static. They knew. They knew before we lost. The third record was the one that had stopped Vethara's secondary heart again when she found it. It wasn't from the hegemony. It was a human transmission, directed not at any military target but at the monitoring post itself, which was Dominion property, observing neutrally, beyond the engagement zone. The humans had known it was there. They had pointed a transmission directly at it. On day 149, when they were fighting for survival against the remnants of a million-ship fleet, they had taken the time to send a message to the Dominion Observer Post. The message was brief. The translation team had worked on it for 2 days. They're asking us to witness, Oranvasht said. He'd seen the translation. His voice was strange. They're asking us to stay, Vethara said, to keep the monitoring post active, to keep watching, to not look away. She met his eyes. They sent that message on day 149, 14 days before the end, while they were still in the middle of it. Why, he asked. She had an answer. She'd had it since she'd read the translation the first time. She hadn't said it aloud because saying it aloud required accepting what it implied. Because they wanted someone to know, she said. They wanted a record to exist, not of the battle, of the cost. She stopped. I think they knew they might not have anyone left to tell the story themselves. I think they wanted to ensure that what they were doing, what it took, would not disappear with them if they lost. The room was so quiet she could hear her own hearts. They were preparing for the possibility that humanity wouldn't survive. One of the younger analysts said from the far end of the table, the first time he'd spoken all session. And in that preparation, they chose to spend transmission time during an active engagement, making sure someone would remember. Not for sympathy, Vethara said. Look at the message again. They're not asking for help. They're not reporting their status. They're asking the Dominion to bear witness. That's different. She thought about it. I think they wanted the galaxy to understand what this cost, not to celebrate it, to understand what a species has to be willing to become in order to survive something like this. She found the final record on the 6th day of searching the debris field directly, aboard a salvage shuttle, while the investigation fleet remained at a safe distance, and she insisted, over Oranvasht's objections, on going in personally. She was 40 meters from the hull fragment when she found it. It was a human escape pod, which was not unusual. There were thousands of them in the debris field, most empty, some still containing remains. But this one was broadcasting, faintly on a frequency so low it had been below the investigation fleet's detection threshold, actively broadcasting, on repeat. She matched the pod's tumble and extended a connection line, and pulled herself to the hatch and looked through the viewport. Inside were 2 humans. One was motionless. She could not determine with certainty whether alive or dead. The other was seated at the pod's minimal control panel, and this one was conscious. She could tell because when she looked through the viewport, the human turned and looked back. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the human said something. She couldn't hear it, vacuum, and the pod's audio wasn't connecting, but she could see the mouth moving, and she had spent 6 days studying the human language fragments in the recovered battle logs, and she had gotten, through the translation team's help, marginally better at reading it. She thought the human said, "We held." She connected the audio. "Can you hear me?" she said in trade lingua. The human's expression shifted in a way she had no reference for. Then, "Yeah," a pause. The voice was very tired, the kind of tired that lives in the bones, not the muscles. "Yeah, I can hear you." "Are you injured?" "Kessler is." The human looked at the motionless figure briefly. "She's stable. I've kept her stable. We've been out here for a pause. I've lost count. The pod's clock says 19 days. 19 days. Alone in a debris field of 1,000,000 destroyed warships, keeping her companion alive, broadcasting on a low-frequency channel, and hoping something would hear it. "What is your name?" Vithara asked. "Commander Adisa Akafer, United Earth Defense Force." A pause. "What's left of it?" She didn't ask about the fleet. She asked, "Commander Akafer, the debris field, the orientation of the wreckage, the hegemony ships, they were all turned away from your system, toward the border, trying to leave." Akafer was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the debris field rotated slowly past in the background, catching starlight. "We let them turn," he said. "Why?" "Same reason you'd let something wounded try to run." He looked at her. His eyes were dark, and in them was something she recognized now that she hadn't had a name for before, the look of someone who had paid a price so large that the transaction had become part of their identity. "We needed them to understand what they were leaving, what they were running from. If they just died advancing, their command would call it acceptable losses, call it a setback, send another fleet eventually." Vithara felt cold. "But if we let them turn," he said, "if we let them run," and then he stopped, started again. "We needed the hegemony to report home. We needed the survivors to make it back across the border and report what we'd done to them. We needed 1,000,000 ships to try to run and fail." He looked past her at the debris field. "We needed the hegemony to be afraid of us, specifically afraid, not of our fleet is gone, afraid of the kind of species that does what we just did." "And the kind of species," Vithara said carefully, "that does what you just did, what is that?" For a long moment he said nothing. "A species that decided it wasn't going to stop," he said. "We're not the strongest thing out here, we know that. We never thought we were, but we decided a long time ago before this as a species that there was no version of this where we stopped. No losses that would make us stop. No cost we weren't willing to pay. And we needed the hegemony to understand that. Really understand it, not as a military assessment." He looked at her again. "As a fact of nature." She thought about the 1,000,000 ships turned inward. She thought about the 4 billion civilians dispersed into deep space before the invasion began. She thought about the volunteers left behind in occupied systems, transmitting until they were found. She thought about the human command structure deliberately dissolved so it couldn't be targeted. She thought about the message on day 149, "Bear witness." "The hegemony will not send another fleet," she said. "No," Akafer said, "they won't." He said it without satisfaction, without triumph, with the flat certainty of a person who has looked at a thing long enough to simply know its shape. "Nobody will, not for a long time." He looked down at his hands, at whatever damage 14 months of war and 19 days in a survival pod had done to them that she couldn't quite see from her angle. Whether that was worth it is a question I'm going to spend a very long time trying to answer. She moved to disengage the connection, to call in the rescue shuttle, to do the practical things that the situation required. Then she stopped. "Commander," she said, "your message, on day 149 to our observation post." He waited. "Why did you want us to watch?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because in 1,000 years, someone in your civilization is going to look at humanity and try to calculate whether we're a threat. And they're going to look at our numbers and our technology and our fleet strength, and they're going to run their models." He looked directly at her through the viewport. "I wanted someone to be alive who had watched this, who could tell them, those models are missing a variable." The rescue shuttle docked 40 minutes later. She watched them carry Kessler out first, and then Akafer walked out under his own power, which he did not need to do, and which she was certain no other consideration in his life had been more important than doing. She stood in the shuttle bay and thought about the debris field, 1,000,000 warships, every fragment oriented toward the border, everyone turned toward home at the end. Not because the humans had broken them militarily, not entirely. Because the humans had made them understand something that no combat model, no fleet projection, No wargaming simulation had ever captured and perhaps ever could, that they were not fighting an opponent who was calculating acceptable losses. They were fighting an opponent who had already decided, somewhere deep and collectively and irrevocably, that there was no such number, no loss too large to bear and continue, no darkness deep enough to make them stop. Vithara filed her report that night. It was the longest report she had ever written. It took her 11 hours. When she reached the conclusion, she sat for a long time without typing, staring at the cursor. Then she wrote, "The hegemony's strategic error was categorical, not tactical. They analyzed humanity as a military force. They should have analyzed humanity as a condition. Military forces can be defeated. Conditions must be endured. The hegemony discovered too late that they had not invaded a civilization. They had tried to extinguish a fire by stepping into it. The fire did not go out. The hegemony is gone." I do not believe this outcome would have changed if the hegemony had sent 2 million ships or 10 million. I believe humanity calculated that it wouldn't change. I believe that calculation was the strategy. She submitted the report. She turned off her console. In the darkness of her quarters, with the debris field silent outside her viewport, she thought about one last thing. The human word from Akafar's first transmission, the one she'd almost been certain she'd lip-read correctly. We held. Not asterisk we won, not we survived, not we defeated them. We held, as if winning had never been the question, as if the only question that had ever mattered was whether they would still be standing when the question resolved itself. As if all of human history, all of human experience, all of whatever it was that made them willing to let 4 billion of their people vanish into deep space and send volunteers into occupied territory and dissolve their own command structure and absorb 40% casualties on day 12 as an asterisk-controlled variable. All of it had been building toward the simple, devastating, inarguable fact that they had not let go. That they never let go. The debris field turned in the starlight outside her viewport, a monument 11 light minutes across to everything that had failed to make them stop. And the thing that made the back of her mind go very quiet and would not leave her for the rest of her life was not the scale of it. It was the knowledge that somewhere in the 7 remaining human systems, a civilization that had just fought a war of this cost was rebuilding, was planning, was preparing for whatever came next. Not because they believed the next thing was coming soon, but because preparing for the next thing was simply what they did. What they had always done. What they would always do. And whoever sent the next fleet would discover, as the hegemony had discovered, that the variable missing from every model was not a number or a technology or a tactical innovation. It was a decision, made once collectively and never revisited. We do not stop. The stars outside were very old and very cold and very still.